So tonight we want to talk about Jupiter, the sage. And when we talk about Jupiter, there's quite a bit. How many of you, I'm just curious, just a show of hands, how many of you have done much of any kind of reading in mythology? Show of hands. Okay. Okay. Because a lot of the knowledge that we have are based on astrology, or that is involved in astrology, you can gain from mythology. The mythological stories, when we understand the nature of myth, and it really has a bad name because the academics really don't understand it, and they think it really expresses a more primitive mind and childlike nature from the standpoint of humanity, and that really isn't the case at all, because this relates back to that time in human evolution when we were all clairvoyant. We had spiritual sight. We could see into the spiritual worlds. We had conscious interaction with beings that we would correctly call gods. And these are the beings that really are in charge of creating, maintaining, and destroying this universe, or that are here to really implement the divine plan. And there was that time in the ancient past, and it was more, we didn't have freedom at that point. We didn't have a really developed sense of individuality or self, but we were still very much connected with the spiritual worlds, and we had that ability to see into the spiritual worlds, and as a result, we had the opportunity to have the conscious relationship with the gods. And when we speak of the gods, when we start talking about the names of the planets, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, etc., these are all the names of gods, and they're real beings. When we start talking about Jupiter, one of the things that we want to understand, it is that which rules the higher wisdom mind. Because there's many, many levels to consciousness. But when we talk about Jupiter, it's what rules the higher wisdom mind. And before the modern planets, which are the planets Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto that were discovered from 1791 on, Jupiter was that planet that would be associated with higher states of consciousness and enlightenment. Then it was more described from the standpoint of wisdom or understanding, which we're going to get into more. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about archetypes, just briefly, so that we have an understanding of how this word was used by Plato and the ancients, and how it directly relates to the planet Jupiter. Because if we were going to talk about a planet that really embodies the whole principle of archetypes, it is the planet Jupiter. And here, just so we know, there's the symbol for Jupiter. But the type of consciousness that is represented by Jupiter is archetypal consciousness. What do we mean by that? How many of you have some remembrance or background in terms of the Greek philosopher Plato? Just a show of hands. Okay. When we talk about Plato, Plato is a very key figure in Western culture and civilization. And when he, in the dialogues that come down to us, he laid out a whole metaphysical structure of understanding of life and of creation, and how everything is structured and how it works. And one of the most fundamental teachings or principles of Plato is that there's a divine realm of ideas. And in fact, he spoke, this was the basis of all life and of all of creation, was that there is a divine realm of ideas. And when we speak of ideas, they're not abstract, they're living forces and powers, they are living beings. And this is a description, if you will, of the mind of God. So when we start talking about this being that is the ultimate reality of which we and everything in creation is the expression of, all of this is generated from divine thought and divine ideas. And again, remembering that we are the microcosm of the macrocosm, that the design of the human being is that of God, if you will, in miniature. And so it's also a way of understanding ourselves. We are familiar with thought and with thinking. On a cosmic level, this same process takes place. And we will find that this being that is the ultimate reality, the supreme being, whatever name we want to give it, that it is a being of consciousness. Its very nature is intelligence. And it is evolving just as we are evolving. And that it discovers itself, literally discovers itself through its creative expression. So that when it has this cycle of being awake and being asleep, and some of you have heard me talk about these vast periods of time, but the waking phase of the Supreme Being, which is the creative expression of itself, is 311 trillion 40 billion years. And then there's a cosmic sleep. In the Vedic terminology, that the creative expression is what is called a manvantara. And that when it goes to sleep, which results in a cosmic dissolution. Everything that's been created, the entire creation, dissolves back into pure consciousness, because everything is consciousness. And so this being goes to sleep again, and it sleeps, it rests. Just as we have our 24-hour day cycle of rest and activity, this being also has its expression of rest and activity, which we experience as its creative expression and its dissolution expression. And again, we're the same. But when this being wakes up, after its sleep, after a pralaya, after a cosmic dissolution, then it wakes up just as we do in the morning, where we left off the night before we went to bed, to where there were still thoughts and ideas that we had that still we have the intention of putting into expression and fulfilling. And we will actually find that all of the karma of the previous creation is shrunk down into an egg. It's called the hiranya garbha, the golden egg, that Vishnu, or however we describe it, sleeps on this in the cosmic ocean. A lot of this is picture consciousness, but again, this is myth, but it's true. That there is this part that does stay awake while the rest is really asleep. And then when this being awakes, it awakes back to what has already been completed through the previous creations, the seed of all of the karma that is there, and then the intention of what still is to be completed is then the intention that forms the basis of the expanding. And in fact, that is the planet Jupiter. The principle of expansion is the planet Jupiter. And when we talk in the Vedic terminology, in the Sanskrit language is very, well, it's actually a celestial language. It's the language of the gods. It's known as Devanagari. And Devanagari literally means the language of the gods. So when we speak of the language of the Vedas, it is a cosmic universal language that contains all of this knowledge and all of this wisdom within it. And it is that when this being awakes and starts to think and starts to have intention, that intention begins to express and begins to take form and manifest. And we will learn and become this ourselves. When our consciousness is developed enough, we will find that all that it will take for us to have a thought, and it will manifest physically. And that's exactly what happens in this process where the creator being has thoughts or intentions, and then those actually go through the process of taking form. But when we go back to that highest level of the divine mind, the cosmic mind, the cosmic consciousness, in its wakeful state, this aspect of the divine mind or the cosmic mind is very orderly in terms of the thoughts and ideas of the creator being. When we start talking about this level of the divine mind, of these divine thoughts and ideas, these are what we speak of as archetypes. And everything in creation, not just here on earth, everything in creation, we will find is expressive of divine thoughts or ideas or divine archetypes. Jupiter is the planet that relates and rules and embodies this principle of the divine thoughts, the divine ideas, the divine archetypes. And then when we start applying this to astrology as a whole, every planet is a god, and actually is, when we speak of these archetypes, we don't want to think too abstractly. Like, this term was frequently used, archetypes was frequently used by Carl Jung, and very profoundly. Yet he would not accept that these archetypes had an objective living reality outside of the human being. He would only accept that archetypes were subjective within the consciousness of the individual. He did not accept an outer metaphysical reality where these things existed in their own right, whether they were human beings or not. And that's what we have to understand when we're truly understanding archetypes, is that these are beings, cosmic forces, cosmic powers that embody divine ideas. They are living, vibrant forces that are ideas at this level, and they evolve. They're not static, they're dynamic, and they evolve. And there's limitless levels in which these divine ideas are gods. That's why the ancients called them gods. And they had a relationship with them, and they are gods. They are not the God. They are expressions of God. They are manifestations of God. They are qualities of God. So these are different attributes of God when we speak of archetypes or we speak of gods, because you can actually use those terms interchangeably from a true metaphysical standpoint. So everything in creation is expressive of an idea or an archetype. One way to understand it is that in astrology, it's kind of mind-boggling. For those of you who have some background in astrology, you may be familiar with it, but everything that we know has a planetary rulership, meaning you go through the entire plant kingdom, and every plant has a planetary ruler. You go through the animal kingdom. Every animal has a planetary ruler. You go through the mineral kingdom. Every mineral has a planetary ruler. What does that mean? It means that these different levels of creation and these different expressions of life embody the archetypes of those particular planets. So that we're talking about an energy and a force and a power and a function. The more esoteric you get in terms of understanding the nature of ideas and the nature of planets and signs of the zodiac, this relates, they're principles and powers and forces, but they relate to functions. So when we start talking about a plant that's ruled by Mars, it means it's embodying the Mars function. If we have an animal that embodies the sun, is ruled by the sun, it means it embodies and is ruled by the sun, the function of the sun. If we have a mineral that is ruled by Mercury, and Mercury is even a mineral, we're going to find that it embodies the Mercury principle or the Mercury function or the Mercury archetype. And so we're going to find there's nothing in creation that is not imprinted and is not founded and structured in terms of a divine thought or a divine idea that has taken symbolic form. This idea has taken form based on sacred geometry and the laws of that particular realm that it manifests in, whether it's the mineral kingdom or the plant kingdom or the animal kingdom or the human kingdom or the angelic kingdom. You're going to find the same thing when we start getting into the spiritual hierarchies, which Judy and I were talking about before class, because when we get into that which relates to the spiritual hierarchies, every life wave of beings has a planetary rulership. What does that mean? It means that they embody this particular principle or force or power or function. And this relates back to the divine ideas of Plato. If we truly and correctly understand it, there is this realm that is the basis of all life and all creation within the divine mind that is the entire cornucopia, if you will, of divine intelligence and thought and intention. And then all of this expresses through all the layers of creation, through infinite diversity of form, to give expression to some very basic fundamental principles. Jupiter is the planet that rules this whole thing of divine ideas. Jupiter is the planet that rules these archetypes. So when we start talking about ourselves in terms of human beings and we understand that we are the microcosm of the macrocosm, what does that mean? It means this entire creation is structured inside each one of us. All these divine ideas All these divine archetypes are structured inside of us. Literally, every one of the planets, every one of the signs of the zodiac is structured inside of you, plus much more. But just to have that understanding, which means, wow, how does astrology work? Well, it means when there's activity and interrelationships going on with the planets and the stars out there, those same types of interactions and interrelationships are going on inside of you. And that's happening at every level. It's happening in the mineral kingdom, that dynamic is going on. It's going on in the plant kingdom. It's going on in the animal kingdom. It's going on in the human kingdom. It's going on in the angelic kingdoms. And this is literally the mind of God, or the archetypes, or the divine ideas and the principles, and how they're meshing at any point in time. But they, in and of themselves, have their own purity. And so archetypes, when they are living forces and powers, we can think, we become so materialistic as a culture. When we think of astrology, we can think of it in a very abstract way. We don't want to think about it in an abstract way. You want to think of it in a very living and dynamic way. It's alive. You're talking about forces and powers, and they themselves are evolving. Just as this being that is the ultimate reality is evolving. Going back to that picture, it is a true statement to say that the Supreme Being, this being of ultimate reality, is in an eternal process of creative expression for its self-discovery. It discovers who it is by what it is able to create out of itself. And we are the microcosm of the macrocosm. The further along spiritually, and this is one of the things that Rudolf Steiner brought out that some of you are familiar with, the master, 20th century master from Austria, that this is an evolving process that is never completed. I mean, ultimately there is a completion. But it is where we have to come to that point where all of this is constellated within our own consciousness in a way that is in a perfect reflection of that of the divine consciousness. If we look inside, for most of us, we're going to look in where we're going to see disorderliness, we're going to see chaos, we're going to see everything all mixed up together in terms of our own thinking and our own consciousness. But here, when we have that understanding that all of this consciousness is structured inside of us, and again, Maharishi, one of my masters, would say, and it was one of his main themes for years, he had a statement, well, in fact I'll write it on the board, and again, what I'm about to write on the board, it relates to what we're talking about, and it relates to understanding Jupiter. And it's a way of understanding and kind of owning this ourselves so that we're able to bring it home in a very living, real way within our own personal lives. Knowledge is structured in consciousness. And what he's saying here is we can go out there and read all the books that we want, we can study, we can do all these things, and don't get me wrong, that's really good. But the reality is that all that knowledge is already inside of you. It's structured in our consciousness. It's structured in our being. You already have it. You own it. It's inside of you. It's the same way as saying that you have all of the planets inside of you. You have all of the signs of the zodiac inside of you. You have all of the divine ideas, all of the divine thoughts, all of the divine archetypes inside of you. All it takes is accessing them consciously, establishing an orderliness, because for most people it's very chaotic, and really being able to consciously work with it. And then that results in our own creative expression, because we want to understand our destiny, our dharma, as a life wave of beings. We are to be the co-creators of this creation with God, with the Supreme Being. This being took it so far. And we will find the actual design of this creation is that mankind has to rise to that level of consciousness and embrace and own its innate ability of its enlightened consciousness and its inherent creative expression, in order to co-create and complete this creation. This creation cannot be completed without mankind's conscious participation. And that's where the struggle is, because we haven't really measured up to that which needs to be done in terms of our point, and things will, get stuck. Things are still moving along, but it's, well, it also gets into the Jupiter consciousness here too, because the creative process, we are creator beings. And we are going to find that we basically create out of impulses, inner impulses of intelligence or inspirations. Basically where we get thoughts, we get ideas, we get inspirations, we get visions, we get all these things. And when we talk about it, again, we're talking about the planet Jupiter. Jupiter is this planet of wisdom and understanding. It's this expansive consciousness. It is the basic principles of higher truth and divine law that we can express in all kinds of ways, whether that is, in terms of thoughts and ideas that become principles and forces and powers. I mean, if you approach it from the scientific standpoint and you look at it from the standpoint of scientists, especially physicists, they're trying to be able to express cosmic law, cosmic truths in mathematical equations. And for them, that is their particular test. They may know and understand a principle, but until they can express it in a mathematical formula, they can't prove it. And that's one of the things about the unified field theory and all of these other things that Einstein, everybody senses and feels that it's true and it's out there, yet they can't prove it from the standpoint of a mathematical formula. And until they can do that, they really haven't proven it. And here we're talking about two different languages. We're talking about a language of archetypes where we know, for example, the ultimate oneness of all of life, the ground of being, the unity that is the basis of all life, yet trying to be able to prove it through mathematical formulas. Math is one symbol system. There's many symbol systems in which all truth is structured. But again, to be able to show it and demonstrate it mathematically, and this is what physics itself has, that's how it's defined its way of being able to prove certain truths. Because again, when we talk about Jupiter, it is higher truth. And we would spell it with capital T, capital R, capital U, capital T, capital H. This is the divine truth. This is the absolute truth. This is the higher truth. This is the truth that is based within the mind of God or the universal principle of creative intelligence. So when we talk about this and we have this understanding of the structure of the divine mind are these living archetypes, these living beings, these living gods, and guess then how they actually manifest physically in terms of the stars and the planets. If you look out in the sky at night and you look at the stars and the planets, you're actually looking at, you could say, the nerve endings of the brain of God. And that there are beings that actually are incarnate in those particular bodies, stars, planets, these kinds of things. And so when we then understand that each one of these beings embodies within itself a divine archetype, a divine principle, a divine force, a cosmic law, and all of that permeates every level of creation and every level of our own being, then we begin to understand that everything is mind. And that is Jupiter. And that's why it is known as the planet of wisdom and the planet of understanding. And that is that's one of its primary expressions. And Margot was mentioning here, we're going to kind of segue somewhat, but why is it then, we're also going to find that Jupiter is also the planet of happiness. Of all the planets, and all the signs of the zodiac and all that, what is the planet of happiness? It is the planet Jupiter. Can anyone think of what kind of connection there would be between what we've already been talking about in terms of the higher mind and all of this kind of stuff and its relationship to happiness? Okay, will help. Yeah, Rosemary.
No.
Oh, oh come on. No, and this we want to understand from the standpoint of development of consciousness and the evolution of consciousness. Because again, when we understand the deeper principles behind all life, we're going to find that we are involved in an evolution of consciousness. This being that is the source of everything and contains everything is evolving. And it is in this eternal process of self-discovery through its creative expression, as we had mentioned. And so this is a process that really applies, or it's a principle or a law that applies to everything in creation. Everything is evolving. Nothing is static. And that we'll find that then if we want to accelerate from our standpoint as human beings, if we understand that the basic principle of life is growth, evolution, and wanting more and more. And in fact, that's one of the things I started to mention earlier. Jupiter's also the principle of expansion. And most of us have heard about the expanding universe and the Big Bang, and that the universe is continuing to expand out, that the actual principle of life is expansion and growth, which it is. And if we get into the Sanskrit language, the actual word brah, which is the root of Brahma, literally means expansion. So it's saying the very creator being, because in the Vedic tradition, Brahma is the creator, Vishnu is the maintainer, Shiva is the destroyer. But in terms of the creative aspect of this deity, of this being, the very nature, the very force, the very power that it embodies is that of expansion, which is Jupiter. And that's why this being's name is Brahma. And in fact, when we speak of Brahman consciousness, I mean, there's a lot of stuff gets in here. It's basically where an individual's consciousness is expanded out, quite frankly, in both an inner way and an outer way. It encompasses basically the entire consciousness of the being that is the ultimate reality. And so, again, I wanted to make that connection. But taking it back to us personally, we're in a process of growing consciousness. And that is the name of the game in terms of human evolution. And it's the evolution of it, and it's the basis of everything. But want to make it a little bit more personal so we can understand this thing of happiness. All of the spiritual teachers, all of the spiritual traditions will say, the first thing that a student must do in order to really be able to step on the accelerated path of evolution of consciousness is that first of all they must study. And you will find back in the ancient mystery schools of the ancient world and even today that which the student had to do was to study, and not just study, go to the library and study a bunch of books. No, this was study the ancient teachings and the spiritual teachings and the sacred texts, because contained within the sacred texts were the cosmic laws and principles and truths that form the basis and foundation of all of life. If they form the basis and foundation of all life, we know, based upon what we were speaking of earlier, we are then delineating or really getting into a level of understanding of the divine laws, the divine principles, the divine ideas of the cosmic mind that are the basis of all of life. As we study, the very process of studying these divine truths, which we will also find that Jupiter is what expresses through what we know of as religion, philosophy, and metaphysics, and all three of those are really looking at the big picture and wanting to know and understand the divine archetypes, the divine laws, the divine principles that form the basis of life. As we study these, that process of study enlivens the consciousness of those principles within our own being. Whatever we put our attention on grows. So when we find that we begin to study truth, divine truth, it actually enlivens it within our own consciousness. It wakes it up. It actually starts getting it organized. And it becomes a growing, as we do it consistently and we do it on a regular basis, we find that this growth of consciousness and this growth of truth begins to accelerate within our life. You can feel it as a very definite and real momentum. And then as you're doing this, you're thirsting for truth, you're desiring for truth, you're questing for truth, and understanding just grows and grows and grows, which it feels almost like you can't get enough. And so as we could say that what is involved in this process is a cultivating of the mind. But we want to be clear, because Jupiter is the cultivating of the higher wisdom mind. This is different than the lower concrete practical mind. So again, we speak of Jupiter, it's related to the higher wisdom mind and these divine ideas and these divine archetypes. And to the degree that we place our awareness on this and start studying it, it enlivens them. They begin to grow and they begin to evolve in your consciousness. I mean, it's really amazing because if you do this, you will experience it. And it's like they become a force and a power within your being and within your life and within your consciousness. And where, as you've enlivened them within yourself, you then begin to see them in an outer way. It's like you activate and enliven what's in here. Well, it's like the old principle, I think we've all heard of this statement, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. What does this mean? We all have structured within us the consciousness of beauty. It's part of life. It's part of these divine laws and principles. Yet we're going to find that most people do not have a highly developed sense of beauty. They do not have a highly developed aesthetic sense. Why not? Because they have not cultivated it. They have not developed it. They have not unfolded it. It's sitting there latently. It's there, but they have to go in and really have a motivation, an intention to really make that a living presence within their own lives. And then once someone who has a love of beauty is going to very much be involved in creating that beautiful things and appreciating beautiful things. And then guess what? Then their whole consciousness shifts and they see everything as beautiful. And I don't mean in some illusory kind of way, I mean in a very real way, because one of the most fundamental principles of life is the principle of beauty. But it takes that enlivened consciousness within ourselves to be able to see it. It's omnipresent, it's everywhere. But how many people actually see it, and to what degree does it really play a vibrant part in people's lives? Well, if we really look at the level of culture that we have and what passes for beauty in our culture, well, we'd say this really hasn't been cultivated to a very great degree. In fact, we're going to find in a lot of respects that the culture seems to be going backwards in a certain respect or being corrupted. The same principle, though, is true in terms of understanding how the consciousness of truth, as we cultivate it and develop it within ourselves through study, then it becomes a force and a power within our own life, and then we begin to see that all life is structured on these principles, and we see them and we understand them because that consciousness has been enlivened in us, and now we can then see, oh my goodness, yeah, wow, it's everywhere. This is very fulfilling stuff. Okay, we do that, then we find as you cultivate the mind and it's based in truth, and where the individual's consciousness increasingly becomes more of wisdom and understanding, which by its very nature is holistic. We want to be clear. We talk about Jupiter and we talk about the knowledge and wisdom associated with Jupiter. It's a holistic wisdom. Mercury is related to the intellect, is the ability to tear apart. In fact, think of it this way, in differentiating these two aspects of mind. Mercury is what rules the lower concrete practical mind. Jupiter is what rules the higher wisdom mind. And most of us, the experience that we have as being human beings here is that there is so much. We feel so overwhelmed by all of the diversity, by all of the variety of all of life's expressions, that most of us feel overwhelmed when we're young. In the nature of the mind, and this is the lower concrete practical mind, this is Mercury in contrast to Jupiter. The intellect, or let's be more specific, the intellect, which is one expression of Mercury. The nature of the intellect is to tear apart. Its principle is discernment and discrimination, or the ability to differentiate. or to divide or separate in order to create the ability to compare. Because we will find one of the basic qualities of consciousness is that of evaluating or judging, which has to be based on a basis of comparison. This is Mercury, and it tears apart. It's to break every whole down into its parts, and then to look at each one of the parts and study the parts, and come into an understanding of the part. And as we come into an understanding of the part, then begin to put it back with the other parts to recreate the wholeness. It's how the mind gains understanding, because it's too overwhelmed, so it has to tear everything apart down to its basic constituents, understand those basic constituents, and then build it back up again. But Jupiter, in contrast, is the knowledge and wisdom of wholeness, where the consciousness of Jupiter is being able to see the whole and automatically be able to see how all the parts contribute to the whole, how all the parts are interdependent and work with each other and create the wholeness. But we also want to be very clear that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Cosmic law. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Even if you study all the parts and you have an understanding of them and you put them all back together so you have an understanding, you're still not going to be in Jupiter consciousness until you're able to see beyond just this functional aspect of the parts. You have to be able to see the whole, and that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, meaning there's levels and levels and levels and levels to understanding. And that's one of the things about the growth of consciousness. So as the mind is consciously being cultivated in terms of being able to understand and live in higher truth, that is step one. Step two is automatically, as a certain level of wisdom and understanding is being developed on the part of the individual, then automatically it begins to cultivate the heart. And you want to be clear about these principles, because love, which is the basis of happiness, is based on wisdom and understanding. And if wisdom and understanding has not been cultivated within the consciousness of the individual, the degree of happiness, the degree of love, is going to be very limited. We're going to find that there is a direct connection between wisdom, Jupiter, the planet of wisdom, and happiness. Jupiter is also the planet of happiness. Why? Because for one to be happy, one has to have a certain awareness or consciousness of the truths of life. You're going to find that this perception and consciousness of truth is a fundamental necessity in terms of a true inner state of happiness, a true inner consciousness. And when we do have an understanding, it's when basically anything that happens to us in life, we understand it. We understand it in terms of the outworking of certain principles, certain laws, certain necessities, these kinds of things. What does that create within us? When we have, and it's also, I haven't thought of it, I have thought of it, I didn't explain it this way, but another way to understand this too is that Jupiter is also the planet of, and it's based upon what we've really been talking about, not what the church often talks about. But Jupiter's the planet of faith and trust. And that is not about blind faith, it's not about blind trust. It's about faith and trust that's based on the knowledge of higher truth. And when one has an understanding of higher truth, it means we understand cosmic laws and principles or archetypes. It's like saying, oh yes, we understand the nature of karma, the law of karma. We understand the law of reincarnation or rebirth. When we understand the laws of attraction. We understand all of these things. What are we talking about? We're talking about divine archetypes and ideas, but cosmic laws and principles that rule life. When our consciousness is well established in these higher truths or this wisdom, we are able to develop a real tangible faith and trust in life, because we know that there's a higher intelligence and a higher consciousness that is orchestrating everything, and that even though things may appear to really, on the surface, to not be good, I mean, it'd be like looking at the state of the world today and really saying, my God, you read all of these newspaper headlines and you look at the top of the news. You don't even have to look at the top of the news, look at the whole news. There's nothing but bad news. There's all this stuff going on. And we could focus on all that and really get into a very negative state. You say, whoa, this is really, look at all the darkness, look at all this awful stuff that's going on, look at all this conflict, look at all this suffering, all this unhappiness, all of these things. But if we have an understanding of higher truth, we're able to look at that and see it for what it is, but see that literally something good is happening, even though it looks awful. And when I say something good is happening, I don't mean some kind of airy-fairy, delusory kind of thing. No, it's to be able to understand the need for cleansing and purification and healing or clearing out the negative before a higher quality of positive is able to express. It's just like you getting sick. The body has to get rid of these toxins. It has to get rid of this lesser state in order to go to a greater state. And the process of getting rid of these toxins and these illnesses is the state of sickness. Yet we know that this sickness, actually, something good is happening. Because within this process, there's a cleansing and a purification and healing that's going on, which is actually creating the opportunity to go to the next level. Same thing is happening right now in terms of world consciousness. This is a time of cleansing and purification and healing. And we could look at it at one level and say, yeah, it's disastrous. All these people running around saying the sky is falling and apocalypse now and all this. Well, we can understand where they're coming from, but again, they're looking in a very limited way because they don't see it as part of a process that's part of the divine plan that's necessary for us to get to the next level. Because we can't get to the next level to the degree that people's consciousness is so stuck in darkness and negativity and untruth. Can't. It means the collective consciousness cannot support the next level. So what has to happen? Well, there's a collective coming down of bad stuff or retribution or karma coming back so that people have to really see the results of that which they've done so they can shift and change their thinking and shift and change their feeling and shift and change their actions. Because when it's the negative results come back to us, karma, in terms of the things that we have done, that we finally wake up and say, oh, maybe that wasn't such a good thing to do. Gee, maybe it wasn't such a good thing to invade Iraq. You know, just a silly little example. But that was a learning process we all had to learn. And before we can move ahead into a higher state, wow, that has to really get imprinted very strongly within our consciousness. And I'm just using that as an example. We can talk about it at an individual level, collective level. This is Jupiter. This is wisdom, where the faith and the trust, where, oh yeah, I see all of the terrible things that are going on, but I actually know that something good is happening. And I mean truly know that something good is happening. Why? Because I understand the laws of the growth of consciousness. For us to be able to go to the next level, that means we have to clear out the junk. Well, we're clearing out the junk. And what is it for? It's preparatory for a higher state of consciousness collectively of mankind in the world. And the sooner that we kind of wake up and choose to embrace and shift and move in this direction rather than fight it and resist it and be stuck in our old ways, you know, the smoother and quicker it will happen. It's all up to us. We still have free will and choice. Jupiter rules all this. Why does that result in happiness? Because there's an inner state of well-being that basically is saying all is right with the world, even when it may not look that way. And all is right with your life, even though it may not look that way. It takes wisdom and understanding and the ability to see the big picture, to see everything in its correct and right perspective, to understand the cosmic laws that rule life and the evolution of life, that allows us to relax into it and to flow with it in a way that we're not in resistance to it, because it's the resistance to these laws, to these principles, to these forces and powers that really create suffering in life. And if we really get into it, it's all about our ideas being based in untruth, which means in resistance or in conflict with truth. One of the things that we need to keep being reminded of in a very fundamental way about ourselves as human beings is that the very word man, and it means in the generic sense, comes from the Sanskrit root manas, which means to think. Thinking is this process of consciousness that relates to truth. As a person thinks, so they are. Doesn't matter whether the thinking is based in truth and untruth. But whatever a person thinks, that is a reflection of their consciousness. If their consciousness is thinking things that are not based in truth or that are based in untruth, then you're going to find, because thinking is the basis of action, action is the basis of achievement, achievement is the basis of fulfillment, but the very word karma literally means action. And we judge ourselves based upon what we do. But then we have to go back a step further and really see that our actions are based in our thinking. And so if our actions are off or wrong or violating law, it means our thinking is off and violating law, which means it's based in untruth. And we are going to find that all unhappiness and all suffering is based in untruth. So correspondingly, we will find that all happiness is based in truth. And we're going to find that as we cultivate the mind and develop wisdom and understanding, then we are automatically cultivating the heart, because the heart, we want to be clear, is that center within ourselves of consciousness of happiness. We're going to find, to the degree that our hearts are open, or that we have developed and unfolded love, and there's many, many levels of love, to the degree our heart is open, and to the degree that we have the capacity to give and receive love, is the degree that we have the capacity to be happy. It is direct correlation, just like E equals MC squared. It's like a mathematical formula. So you're going to find ultimately that the opening of the heart is directly, to the degree that we can open our hearts, is the degree that we can experience happiness. And we're going to find that how you correctly open your heart is through the cultivating of truth. And Jupiter rules all of these. And it is then, when we talk about it, it is the planet of wisdom and understanding and metaphysics and philosophy. In fact, and this is a being again. You know, we can go into mythology and say, oh yeah, this is some mythological being that has no reality. I assure you this being is quite real. And this is the being who's an aspect of the Divine Mother, and her name is Sophia. Does anyone know what Sophia means literally?
The goddess of wisdom.
It's wisdom, literally. It's Greek for wisdom. Sophia equals wisdom. This is the being of wisdom. And in the Vedic tradition, you're also going to find wisdom is a woman. Or I mean, she is a feminine being, a goddess. And you're going to find in the Western tradition too, Sophia is a feminine being. And she's quite real, quite tangible. You can have a conscious, living relationship with Sophia. Gets into deep mysteries, the association of Sophia, this cosmic being, with humanity. Very far out stuff. But then, yes?
I was thinking of Athena also, and I was wondering, would Athena be associated with Mercury then?
Athena is more of the, it would actually be more the planet Uranus, even though if we wanted to talk in terms of astrological, because she is that thought which is inspiration. In fact, if you look, you're going to see that what comes forth from Athena's head directly, full born, and there's the, if we get into the Vedic tradition, they're known as the Manasa Putras, which means the mind-born beings. You know, we're born, but we're not born from mind. We're born from physical bodies. But there's whole beings, and these are gods, that are what are called the mind-born. And we're talking about beings at very, very high level, which means they're generated out of the mind of God. There's various ways of creating, but the...
She was born out of the head of Zeus,
yeah.
Which is Jupiter.
Right. Yeah. No, and that's, okay,
No,
so I see where you're going. I see where you're going.
What the difference was between Sophia and
Well,
because
okay.
Athena was the wise one to lead the soldiers into war.
Right, right. And she has a lot of connotations in this regard. If we go, though, more to the traditional or the more holistic way that we're talking about it, Sophia relates to Jupiter in this regard, which goes back, you could say, yeah, she was born from Zeus. And I should have mentioned this. If we go into the mythological correlations of Jupiter, it's Marduk in the Babylonian tradition, it's Zeus in the Greek tradition, it's Jupiter in the Roman tradition, it's Indra in the Vedic tradition. Every one of those names is the same being, just in different traditions. And it's relating to this specific type of consciousness that we are talking about. But yeah, your point is well taken, mind-born and coming forth from the mind of Zeus. And so there is a correlation in that regard, but this is even profounder and deeper than Athena, okay? And it's where this being, if we get into we were talking about the Kabbalistic tree of life earlier, but this gets into the Kabbalistic tree of life of the Sephirot Bina, which is number 3. There's Keter, Chokmah, and Bina. And Bina is the Divine Mother. And we're going to find that Sophia and the Divine Mother, Bina, the 3rd Sephirot of the tree of life, which is this divine trinity that's the source of everything, that it is from the Divine Mother that Sophia is generated. And Sophia then embodies this cosmic wisdom through all the planes of creation, or all the dimensionalities of creation. And what's amazing about her is that she has actually literally come down to the etheric dimension. She is in exile along with humanity. I don't want to get into too much esoteric stuff, but it is that she needs to be reclaimed. Humanity needs to be, we should say, she needs to be redeemed. Humanity needs to be redeemed. And this relates back to the fall into materiality. And part of it is, when we get into the stories, and these aren't just stories, these are actual cosmic truths, that this aspect of the Divine Mother, Sophia, wanted to be able to see the creation, to see God, to see the Supreme Being from the outside. It's like kind of saying, we all got a real kind of shift in consciousness in a certain respect when in 1969 we had our moon landing and they took a picture of the Earth from the moon. We've all seen that picture of the blue planet that we have very, very beautifully. Well, we could never have a picture of ourselves or our planet like that until we got outside of it. Gives us a whole new perspective. Before then, all we were part of the, we were so inextricably involved in the very earthiness of Earth that we didn't have the ability to kind of step outside of it and look back and see what it was like. In a similar way, on a whole other level, cosmically, Sophia is an aspect of the Divine Mother, the goddess, that had a desire to actually be able to see from outside looking back in terms of the whole creation in a very similar way to what I've just described. And it got her into trouble because she then became involved in humanity's evolution. And humanity has a very challenging evolution. And the fall into materiality, with the fall into materiality, Sophia fell also. And it's also that Sophia, or wisdom, or truth, is our way of getting back home. And humanity and Sophia are intimately interconnected, and where our destinies and our fates are intimately interconnected. And this is another thing that relates to Jupiter and wisdom, to where we're not going to make it if we don't embrace truth, if we don't embrace wisdom and understanding. Now, this is, and I think you will all recognize this, but this then became the basis, and the Greeks actually had a living relationship with her. But this is when this term actually manifested. Philosophia, or philosophy. Anyone know what philosophy means? Philo, Sophia? The love of wisdom. And this literally is what each of us must become, a lover of wisdom. And it is what enlivens this consciousness within you. It's already inside of you. But even what this does for Sophia herself, because it helps to redeem her, she's like in chains in a certain respect. But it is then, and this is all the planet Jupiter. So when we look at this, and just a few things, because we want to go into your guys' charts and understanding it, but this is a topic, obviously, that, again, like so many other topics that we talk about, is so deep and profound, and we could go on and on about it for quite some time. But hopefully it's given you some sense or feeling in a living, kind of vibrant way about what really is involved when we talk about the planet Jupiter. Bringing it down a little bit more, Jupiter, in its transits, entered the sign of the zodiac Scorpio back in October for the first time in 12 years. We want to understand that Jupiter's cycle, how long it takes to go around the zodiac once, is 12 years. So each of us has Jupiter somewhere in our charts. How long does it take Jupiter to go from where it was in our natal chart all the way around and come back again to where it was, or what is known in astrology as a Jupiter return? It's 12 years. Well, there's all kinds of things to that when we start getting into rhythms and cycles, because there's 12 signs of the zodiac, and it's basically Jupiter spending 1 year in each sign. And in this regard, because Jupiter is the planet of wisdom and understanding, when we talk about where Jupiter is transiting, it's transiting that way for all of us, for mankind, for the collective consciousness of all of us. And so it spends a year in each sign of the zodiac, and it's to create the opportunity for us to penetrate in a more deep and profound way into the wisdom and understanding of the energy and the consciousness of that particular sign of the zodiac. Jupiter entered into Scorpio for the first time in 12 years in October, and it will be in Scorpio until near the end of November of this year. And actually, it's March 5th, just a few days from now, that Jupiter is going to go into retrograde motion, and it will be retrograde from March 5th through July 6th. As we've talked about before, all of the planets except the sun and the moon periodically turn retrograde. And retrograde is the spiritual principle of recapitulation, going over old ground, taking care of old unfinished business. So we're about to enter into about a 4 or 5 month period of having a second chance at getting some things right as it relates to Scorpio and deeper wisdom and understanding associated with it. And understand, this applies to all of us. This applies to all of mankind when we talk about this. What is Scorpio? Scorpio is many things. It's the sign of the zodiac of the occult, the esoteric, the hidden, the powers of the soul, the powers of the subconscious mind. Has a great deal to do with psychology and understanding. Again, another Greek word, psyche, which means soul in Greek, ology, the study of the soul. And we're going to find that Scorpio is that sign of the zodiac that rules the power of the soul. There's other signs that rule soul, like Cancer is actually literally the sign of the zodiac that rules the principle of soul. But in contrast, Scorpio is what rules the power of the soul. And the archetype of Scorpio is the magician. And it has to do with unfolding the hidden powers, the hidden resources, the hidden abilities within the human being and within nature. And it is through wisdom and understanding that it is that we are to correctly approach these forces and powers inside of ourselves, outside of ourselves, in order to really be able to unfold their potential. So one of the things that, as we mentioned, but I mentioned it briefly in passing, that we need to spend a little bit more, or I just need to emphasize a little bit more, is that Jupiter, through the role of ruling the principle of expansion, is also the principle of growth. And so when Jupiter is transiting through any sign, it means it really wants to enliven and expand and grow this particular quality of consciousness and the forces and powers and principles associated with it within our individual life, but collectively within the consciousness of mankind. And so it is When we start talking about Scorpio, it is highly resourceful. In fact, that's actually the key word for its first decanate. And it has to do with, well, relating back to certain principles. Would you rather work hard or work smart? Well, hopefully you want to work smart. And that has to do with really using your intelligence or wisdom, Jupiter, to really get much better results from much less effort. There's another cosmic law that is associated with our whole dynamic of life, and it's esoterically known as skill in action. And there is a skill that each one of us must develop to where the principle is we do less and accomplish more. We do less but accomplish more.